Before we get there, a way of introduction, we are in our series Family Matters and fighting for God's plan for the home. And we open this series talking about how good marriages don't just happen and good families don't just happen. They actually take work. You actually have to fight for them. You actually have to put effort into them. You have to seek the Lord. You have to seek God. And you have to fight off the world. You have to fight off the world's desires and the world's way of squeezing you into its mold to rob you of God's best for your life and for your marriage and for your home. And in the beginning, we talked about how God created the heavens and the earth, and we could put a period right there, right? That if God created it, anything that He says and anything He does is what we should be obeying in our lives. And when God says that it's one man and one woman to be married, and to the principles of that God has for them is the way we should desire our marriage should be, the way we should desire our family to be. And when we walk away from that, we get less than what's best that God has for us and for our marriage and for our family. And when we try to reverse the roles or when we try to change God's plan, we will not get God's best. We will not get His blessing that we could have had by our marriages and by our families. And last week we talked about if you want your marriage to be the best that it is, you are to submit to God and make Him the foundation of your life, and also make Him the foundation of your marriage. When it all comes down to it, the marriage foundation should not be on children, because we know children are a gift from the Lord, but they grow up. They grow up really fast. And I was just thinking this week of how fast they grow up and how fast things happen and how fast, children come and they grow and then they go away and then they come back and they go away and they come back and they go away and come back. Most of the time around dinner time they come back, right? And they come back, but you know when you look at your children, you know they're just passing through. And when they leave, your family, your marriage better be strong. It better be founded on the right thing. Not just children, not just personalities, not just yourself or your desires, but founded on God. What God wants for our marriage. And we talked about a little bit about what happens when we do that. But this morning I want to talk about the gospel in marriage. And the reason why I want to talk about the gospel in marriage is because the good news about marriage is it brings the best out in people. The bad news is it brings the worst out in people as well, okay? And I would say bring it out. I probably should say reveal. It reveals the best about people, and it reveals the worst about people. And one thing is certain, you cannot hide your sinfulness from your spouse. The time that you spend together, the closeness that you have, just the close proximity of your marriage, you're going to realize the sinfulness of your life and the sinfulness of your spouse. And when you're dating and you're engaged, you try to hide, right, all the imperfections. You try to put your best foot forward. You try to be the best version of you can be. But eventually, when you get married, all of a sudden, it's like a great unveiling. Like, all of a sudden, these things come to surface that you might not have seen before that people tried to hide. I heard of a husband and wife that got married, and on their honeymoon, he was really upset because he wanted to tell his wife before he got married, and she was struggling because she had something she wanted to tell him before they got married. And the husband, he had stinky feet and really bad smelling socks, all right? And so that next morning when he woke up after going on the honeymoon, he thought, well, I'm just going to have to do it. I'm going to have to man up and go tell her how bad my feet stink and how bad my socks are. And so she was in the bathroom getting ready. She thought, he knocked on the door and said, I have something to tell you. She was so excited because she said, I have something to tell you too. And she drew close to him and said, I have a confession. And he recoiled back and said, oh my God, don't tell me you ate one of my socks, right? So it doesn't matter if you have really bad breath or you have really bad smelling socks. Something happens, right? It happens. You're annoying. You make yourself upset. You have sinfulness in your life. We're all self-centered. We all have sinfulness. And the gospel can help your marriage because it empowers your marriage to have God's love in it. And when you come to love in the Bible, there's 3 Greek words about love in the Bible. One is just what we call lust. It's the word eros, E-R-O-S. It's just a lust-centered or a self-fulfilling desire of lust. You have a fleshly desire, and this eros love fulfills that desire. Lust is temporary. Lust comes and goes. Lust is based on feelings. This is not what you build your marriage around. This is not what you build your relationships around. This is not what you should build anything other than just fleshly desires around. But yet in our culture, we take what is the erotic love and we try to glamorize it to make it look like that's what your marriage should be all about. As long as it feels good, as long as your needs are being met, as long as you feel in love or your emotions are doing well, then you're going to have a great marriage. That's why the divorce rate is so high. Because you're not always going to feel like loving your spouse. You're not always going to feel like being a good wife. You're not always going to feel that way. And that's why you hear people say, well, we fell out of love. You can't fall out of love. True love is a decision. It's a sacrifice. Erotic love is something that comes and goes. It's based on feelings. Another word in the Bible is phileo. That's where we get the word brotherly love from. The city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And I said this before, had the opportunity to visit Philadelphia. There's not a whole lot of brotherly love in Philadelphia, all right? Good cheese steaks, but other than that, not a whole lot of brotherly love there. But the marriage is more than just a friendship. You can be best friends, that's great, but that's not going to make your marriage last. A marriage is deeper and greater than just having a great friendship. A great friendship is one thing, a great marriage is another thing. So just friendly love or love that is phileo kind of love is not what the Bible says you need for marriage. If two people love one another and they want what's best, God calls us to an agape love. A-G-A-P-E, agape. And that's a love that only comes from God. That's the kind of love that as you know God, who is love, then you can express the love of God to one another. That as you know God, and that's where the gospel comes is, as you come to know Jesus Christ, He puts this love inside of your heart through the Holy Spirit, and you can experience that love of God so you can give those around you the love of God. It's because of the gospel we know God, and we experience true love, and once we've experienced the unconditional love, then we can express the unconditional love. Love not based on feelings. Love not based on what you can do for me or how you can fulfill my desires, but love based on the character of God. And Romans 5:8 says, but God commendeth His love toward us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You see, God's love for us was not based on Him feeling like He loves us. It was based upon who He was, and He proved His love even at our worst condition. When we had nothing to offer God. I mean, at our absolutely worst condition. John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world, same word, agape, that He gave His only begotten Son, and whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. We experience God's love. That's the good news. And when we come to know Jesus Christ, now we can love our spouse, we can love our families, we can love one another with God's love, the love that we experience. And you say, oh, well, you're telling me that all my marriage needs is just love or more love? No, I'm telling you what your marriage needs is God's love. It needs God's love. You need God's love in your life, and you need God's love in your marriage. You need God's love so you can love your spouse with the love of God. It is impossible to love like God if you've not experienced God's love in your life. What's so special about having God's love in my marriage? I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. That's where 1 Corinthians chapter 13 comes in. I hope you have your Bibles open, because we're going to read a couple scriptures here. And in this letter, Paul is instructing the church at Corinth. And they were experiencing God's love, extremely talented, extremely gifted group of people, but they lacked love. They lacked love for one another. And so Paul begins to instruct them about love, the same principle I talked to you about, love. And Paul gives a description of what God's love really looks like. If you were to cut open God's love, you were to look at it, you were to take the principles of it, Paul was applying this to the church, but we can take it and apply it to our marriages. We could take this and apply it in our families and our homes. And what does the love of God look like? Well, 1 Corinthians verses 4-7, it says this, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Man, you think about it, what a description. When we come to God's love, 15 things here. Suffers long, kind, envy, does not parade itself, does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. You say, wow, one thing's for sure, God's love has a lot of depth to it. And when you begin to think about this and you begin to think about your marriage, you begin to think about how you love people. Is this what your love looks like? And just running through some of them, starting from the beginning. Love suffers long. There's also another word for their patient. Love is long-suffering. The word here is macrothumeo. It's the common word in the New Testament that means being patient with people. Not so much things, but with people. And if you've been married, you know there's a whole lot of patience needed with people, right? Love's patience is the ability to be inconvenienced or annoyed, key word there, by a person over and over again and yet not be upset or easily angered. And I know you're looking at me like, Pastor, are you serious? You're going to start with this one? Don't be mad at me, all right? I'm just the messenger. Tanner said, you made people that loves cats mad. You made the people that drive mad. Who are you going to make mad this morning, Dad? I said, it's like killing the newspaper boy. I have nothing to do with the news. This is just the news, all right? And I know it's tough because this hits home with all of us, does it not? I'd say the biggest struggle in marriage is not the big things, it's the little things. You rarely have blowouts. It's always small leaks. It's small leaks that happens, and it's the little things that drive you crazy about your spouse. It was the little things that made you love your spouse, but now it's the little things that drive you crazy about your spouse. And yet, even in your own life, if we're all honest, we're all a work in progress. No one is the complete person. No one has made all the corrections. No one has everything figured out. We're all a work in progress. There are things that I do that I know make Erin mad. No question about it. You can ask her. She can tell you some of them. And over 20 years, I try to change some of those things, but some things just keep popping out, all right? They keep happening over and over and over and over again. And yet, when you think about it in your life, I guarantee you, every one of you sitting here this morning or has been close to someone knows exactly what I'm talking about. People irritate. They do things that when you come together, they do things you would not prefer. They irritate. They do just little things. The way they squeeze their toothpaste, right? People argue, do you squeeze it from the middle? You squeeze it from the end? You squeeze it from the top, right? Little things like how someone chews their food can drive people crazy. How loud someone talks. How someone has to be somewhere 15 minutes early. How someone doesn't mind to be late everywhere. Someone who drops their clothes on the floor every day. Someone who doesn't turn the lights off. Someone who does, every single one. And I know we make light of these things, but these little things in marriage become big things. They become big things because when we don't have the love of God, we're not long-suffering. We're not patient with one another. We don't suffer long and we lose it and we go off on each other and then we say things we shouldn't say and we do things we shouldn't do and it ruins a marriage. And you say, well, I can't take it any longer. I can't do it any longer. How many times does this person get to do this? And how many times do you do it over and over and over again? Do I have to be patient? Do I have to be long-suffering? Well, let me give you a test. As many times as you've done this to God. God's love for you is not annoyed. It's not ran out on you. It's not impatient with you. You make mistakes and you make mistakes and you sin and you do these things, and yet God is long-suffering with you. The same measure that God is long-suffering with you, that's the way you should be long-suffering with your spouse. We talked about it last week when God tells the husband to love your wife like Christ loves the church. That's what he really means. That when you have these little things and you have these irritations and you have all these things where you got to be patient with another, long suffering with one another. You got to bear through these small things or these little things that can irritate you. Love is long suffering. And the counterpart to that is love is kind. That's the second one. Just as patience will take anything from others, kindness will give anything to others. So instead of reacting in a way that's unkind, you are patient or you're long-suffering and you act in kindness. It's being useful, serving, or gracious. In marriage, we must be kind to one another. Unfortunately, a lot of times for us, the last people we're the most kind to is the ones who's closest to us. We sometimes are kind to people in our job, but we wouldn't talk to them a certain way. We were kind to people at school. We wouldn't treat them a certain way. We were kind to people at church, and we wouldn't treat them a certain way. But when we get home, we do that to our spouse. We do that to our kids. We're unkind to them. But God's love is kind. God's love is willing to give. God's love is willing to serve. God's love is willing to be gracious. God is kind, and we should be kind in our words. There are words that you say in your marriage that are not kind. You shouldn't say them. And I'm going to tell you, whoever said sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, they're a liar, right? Because they are. I can remember every time Erin hurt me physically. No, I'm just teasing. She's never hurt me physically. But you remember every word, do you not? Do you remember when someone calls you a loser? You remember when someone calls you no good. You remember when someone cuts you down or says something about the way you look or your appearance or the way that you do something. You remember that. Words are powerful. Words hurt. And unfortunately, as married couples, we know just the right words to say, don't we? And a lot of times we just can't help it. When the time comes, we use words that are very, very unkind. We got to be kind in our words. Lord, help me with my speech. Help me with the way that I speak to my wife. Help me the way I speak to my children. One of the biggest failures for me as a parent is when my kids work with me. All right? And it's easy to be nice to them when they're not working with me, but when they're working with me, sometimes I tend to get a little too excited, a little too upset. And Tucker has bared the wrath lately, and Tanner has bared the wrath before. And it's shameful for me because I know that's one of my weaknesses. And when I say something that's unkind, I'm convicted by it. Like, why am I so unkind to my children? And let me tell you, as parents, we've got to be real careful to what we say to our children. Our children are in a war zone at school. They're in a war zone in our culture. And when they come home and you tell them they're worthless, and you come home and you tell them they're not any good, you tell them all these things and you're very unkind to them, that they're not going to last very long. We need to be kind to our children. We need to speak good words to them. We need to speak kind words to them. We need to be kind in our words and in our actions. When we treat one another in a certain way or we do things in a manner that's not kind, we show it in the way that our actions are. And it's a great test. Are we seeing God's love in our marriage? Are we gracious? Is your spouse afraid to approach you about something because you're unkind, or they know that you'll say something mean, or they'll act in an unkind way? I tell you, we need kindness in our marriages. We need kindness in our family. The only way it comes is through God's love. We need to submit to God's love. God's love is long-suffering, but it is also kind. And thirdly, love is not jealous. We have quite a bit to go through. We'll get faster through them. And this begins here, the first of the 8 negative descriptions of love. So he tells us things love is, and now he's going to tell us things that love is not. Love is not jealous. Love and jealousy are mutually exclusive. Where one is, the other one can't be. Jealousy is when it upsets you that someone else has something you desire or is better at you than something. That's when jealousy comes in. Jealousy is very destructive in relationships because when a spouse becomes jealous of another spouse, there's major problems. And the major problems arise because when husbands are jealous of their wives or wives are jealous of their husbands, it begins this competition between one another. It breeds contempt. The husband begins to despise the wife. And the wife begins to despise the husband. So what do? They begin to tear each other down. They begin to tear each other down privately, but then it spills over publicly. Let me tell you, if you're a young couple or you're a couple, the first thing and one of the greatest things you can do is not to cut down or to publicly criticize your spouse. You might forget it, but they never will, all right? And when you begin to get jealous of one another and you begin to be jealous of what someone else has and you begin to point out each other's faults and to publicly declare that to their family and friends, there's trouble, lots of trouble. Jealousy shouldn't have any part of a marriage. If you truly love someone, what is there to be jealous about? If you are married to someone, you should want that person to be the best that they could be. Because the best that they could be makes you the best you can be, because without you guys at the best, your marriage is not going to be the best. And I know this is tough, especially when you have kids, because sometimes kids will put one against the other. Well, mom don't talk like that. Well, dad will let me do this. And they start to use their strengths and weaknesses. And next thing you know, you say, well, mom doesn't do this, and then dad doesn't do that. And then publicly you're criticizing one another in front of your kids, and it spills over and it goes further because it's jealousy. You're not competing with one another. We talked about this last week, about accepting your roles that God has given you. It's not a competition. You're to build one another up, not to tear each other down. I mean, if you can't celebrate your spouse's success, then you have problems. It's jealousy. You should want your spouse to be the best that she could be or the best that he could be, because you know that's best for your life, that's best for your marriage. And when you don't have God's love, you become jealous and you become critical and you begin to tear those down. Then it breeds this, that love does not brag. These go hand in hand. When the loving person is himself successful, he does not boast about it. So when you brag about yourself, you not only tear others down, the bragging's the other side of jealousy. Jealousy tears someone down, but bragging lifts you up. It makes you the center of attention. It makes you feel like you're the ones. And it's ironic that most of us dislike bragging people, right? You all know people that can strut sitting down, right? They're bragging about themselves all the time. And we're inclined to brag about ourselves, though. C.S. Lewis said that bragging is the utmost evil. It is the epitome of pride. Because bragging makes you the center of attention. Bragging puts yourself first. It's impossible to build others up when you're talking about yourself all the time. When we brag, we can be up only if others are down. Let me tell you, if you're always bragging about yourself and not your spouse, if you're always talking about how good you are and what you do in your family and what you do with your marriage and how you do all the things right, and you have to be the hero and the center of attention in your marriage and the center of attention with your family, guess what? That's not God's love. God's love doesn't brag on itself. It doesn't brag on yourself. That's not God's love. Bragging is not God's love. And it also runs into arrogance. Love is not arrogant. That's the other part. Love does not brag. Love does not is not tear one another down. Love is not arrogance. Arrogance is bragging is the verbal representation of pride, but arrogance is the action of pride. It's that you say one thing, but when the way you live is in an arrogant way. You make people feel you are superior just by your actions. You have to be the first in line. You have to be served first. You have to be the one who is talked about first. You have to be the one who's number one. You have to be the one who's superior. You have to be the one that gets your way all the time. That's arrogance. You have to get what you like. You have to do what you want's best for you. You have to go where you want to go to eat. All the time, that's arrogance. Even though you may say one thing, arrogance is the way you actually live. That's not agape love. True love is humble. Humble is not feeling sorry for yourself. It's not thinking of yourself at all. That you're willing to put your needs and desires aside, and yet through arrogance, we put ourselves first. And you think about it, God's love chooses a place to eat that maybe your spouse may like. God's love puts your spouse up first. God's love puts their desire first. God's love is not arrogant. You don't brag about it. You don't do your actions about it. You don't have to be first. You don't have to be served all the time. And then it does not act unbecomingly. If you think about it, this is just acting rudely is another way to put it. All these go together. Rudely, to act rudely means you just don't care about it anymore. You know you've reached a bad place in your life when you just don't care what your spouse thinks about you anymore. When you're careless. You're overbearing, you're crude, you're rude, and you don't even care about it. That's the way, when you act in your own love and you become selfish in your own love, that leads to all these things. Love does not seek its own. That's another one. Jesus did not have to be served. He came to serve. And you go through that. Love is not easily provoked. That leads to the arousal of anger and an outburst of emotion or action. Irritated, upset, blowing your top, being mad at all the time because you don't get your ways. Telling our wives or our husband we love them, but yet we get upset and mad and blow the top all the time. Telling your kids you love them, but you scream and yell at them all the time. It's not very convincing, is it? No, it's not. Because they know it's not this thing, and you lose your temper, and you have these fights, and you go through these things, and you have to walk on eggshells around one another. Who wants to live like that? That's a terrible way to have a marriage. It's a terrible way to have a family. And unfortunately, when you don't have God's love in your marriage, that's where it's headed. Because two sinful people are married together without the gospel of Jesus Christ, without the love of God. This is what happens. And this is the way a condition of our marriage gets, and we look to it, and it seems to be hopeless. He kind of changes gears here, and he says, love does not take into account a wrong suffered. This comes as a bookkeeping term to mean calculate or reckon in taking in an entry into a ledger. The ledger is supposed to be a permanent record or recording of something that you spend or some bill or some payment that you make. It's a way of keeping track of things without losing it. And what he's saying here, in God's kind of love, you're not to take into account a wrong suffered, meaning that you need to let things go. You need to forgive. And you don't need to have permanent records. And unfortunately, in marriages, we begin to keep track of things and we have permanent records. One man went to a counselor with his wife, and he said, every time we get in a fight, my wife gets historical. And he says, you mean hysterical? He goes, no, historical. She begins to remind me of every wrong I've ever done since we've been married. And unfortunately, when we don't have God's love, that's what happens. And when you get into an argument and one little thing happens, you're not arguing over your toothpaste. You're not arguing over dropping your clothes on the floor. You're not arguing over how you were driving or if you were late. You were arguing over all the records of wrong that you kept. You're just revealing what's in your heart already, and you've kept all these records, and you won't let them go. You won't forgive, and you won't no longer hold the person responsible for it. Let me tell you that every marriage needs forgiveness. Every marriage needs forgiveness. And when you don't have forgiveness, then you take into account every single thing that's wrong, and every little thing pushes you over the top, and it gets worse and worse and worse. God's love doesn't do that. He doesn't rub your face into your sins and say, you've done this before, I'm done with you, I don't want to do it anymore. No, when we come to our marriages, we need God's kind of love, a record of no wrongs, a permanent record that is gone. We don't get historical. We don't hold everything against them. We don't bring them up every time, and every little thing that comes along doesn't push us over the edge. When was the last time you really forgave your spouse? I know there's a lot of people, and you say, well, you don't know what they've done to me. Well, I don't, but God does. And if God does, then that's all it needs to know, you and God, right? But in your marriage, I can promise you, if you don't forgive your spouse, it's not going to last. It's not going to last because when you have a ledger, a permanent record, and you bring it up, it's just going to eat you alive. And when you don't forgive, I've said it before, it's like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Because you're just gonna fall apart on the inside. And when you look to all these things, you look to your marriage and you say, what kind of love is in my marriage? am I expressing God's love to my spouse? Do I have to be first? Do I lose my cool all the time? Am I jealous of my spouse? Do I have to brag about myself all the time? Do I have to be the center of attention? Do I always have to have it my way? And do I hold these things against my spouse? Because if you do, you're not exhibiting God's love. And it's not going to work. And same on both sides with the spouses. And if your marriage is going to be all that it needs to be, then it has to have God's love, and it has to be lifted up in His name, and you have to live for the Lord and have His love rule in your marriage. And when you do that, Paul continues on down later in these verses, and he says, love bears all things. You see that? I love these 4 statements. Bears means to hold up under. It means to shoulder the load. And I don't know, sometimes marriage gets heavy, right? Sometimes you walk through things together as a couple that you can't make it on your own. And when God's love comes in, it bears up, it supports, it protects, and it bears up all these things from all the ridicule and all the hurt and all the pain that's around. It bears up underneath the load. And for you and your marriage, you need both of you. You need God's love to hold you up. And not only that, it says love believes all things. That's confidence. That's to say, I've been through the trials, I've been through the fire, and I know and I believe and I have confidence in God's love that it's going to hold us up together. Aaron and I have been married for over 21 years. First 21 days, there was probably little questions about if we were going to make it or not. But when you get through marriage and you've been through a lot and you've been through a lot of trials, you've seen your children suffer, you've seen you suffer, you've seen your spouse suffer, you've been through all these things. After years and years and years, you believe and you're confident that you know if you trust in God that it's going to happen. You can have hope. That's what it says next. You can have hope in these things because even though it's shattered and even though things may happen, you have hope in God, in God's love. And that's why I say never give up on a marriage, never give up on a person, because you don't know what God will do in their life. You got to believe and you got to have hope. And then it says love endures all things. It's like a military term where an army holds its position regardless of the attacks. And that's what we must do in our marriage. We must hold our position. We must hold it and we must not give in. And when we do that, love never fails. It never fails. It doesn't say it's 90% correct or 85 or 75. In the second part of in the first part of 14, it says that God's love never fails. Never. And in our marriages, if we want a sure marriage, if we want a marriage that's founded upon God, then we must operate in God's love. Maybe you're here this morning and you say, well, none of that is what I have in my marriage. Well, the good news is that's where the gospel comes in. The good news is that Jesus can change anything. He can change any heart. And I think a lot of times when we think about marriages and we think about people who've been married 50 years and 60 years and been married a long time, you think, wow, they've had the easiest, perfect marriage. Let me tell you, you can't take two imperfect people and put them together and not have issues and problems that only God can work out. I've grown up, saw it firsthand. My mom and my dad met. You want to talk about two opposite people? Complete opposite. My mom was grown up in a small town, and her dad was a farmer. And my dad showed up on a motorcycle and from a motorcycle gang or something. I don't know where he came from. My grandpa looked out there and said, "You ain't going anywhere with him." So much so, the second time he came over, my grandpa had put nails out in the driveway when he pulled up. They gave him a flat tire. Everyone in the whole town, everyone that knew him and everyone that knew them said it was never going to work. Never, ever. But you know what happened? My dad got saved. My mom got saved. Jesus changed their life. And when Jesus changed their life, guess what he changed? He changed their marriage. And almost 50 years later, almost 50 years now, and you meet them today and you say, wow, man, they're a great couple. They weren't always a great couple. God's love made them a great couple. It's not because of what you can do. It's not because of what your spouse can do. It's when you're willing to yield to God. It's when you're willing to yield to the gospel of Jesus Christ. When you're willing to yield to God's love in your life. And even when you don't feel like it. Love is not based on feelings. You're not going to walk out of here and feel like serving your wife. You're not going to walk out here and feel like forgiving your husband. You're not going to walk out of here and feel like doing all these things, because God's love's not based on feelings. It's based on a sacrifice. It's based on commitment. It's based on character. And the gospel comes and it empowers you to do this. And when you do it and you keep true in your life, He will change it. And when you put your marriage upon the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the gospel changes the love that you have for your spouse, and you can build something that's worth lasting a lifetime together. Listen, for us, as we fall trapped to this world, and this world says what you need in your marriage is more. Your husband needs a better job. You need more money. You need a better house. You need more for your kids. But the gospel comes and says, I got all that you need. I got all that you need. I got all the love that you can have, and it's God's love in your life, and you can put it to work in your marriage, and you can put it to work in your life, and it works. It never fails. And so maybe you're here this morning and you say, you know what? I'm annoyed. My husband or my wife's been doing the same thing for year after year after year. Well, maybe it's time to forgive them. I'm going to tell you, you will not get anywhere without forgiving one another. Or maybe you're here and you say, you know what? I've gotten to the point where I'm that person. I have to brag. I have to be first. I've been losing my cool. I've been arrogant. I haven't been putting my wife first. Or I haven't been putting my husband first. Well, maybe this morning, if you'll pray and just ask God to change your heart and change your life, change your marriage, because it'll be worth it. Let's pray together this morning.